Good afternoon, class. I am not with you in person today, but we are still going to go over the notes um, that we need to do today to start the new chapter on bacteria and viruses. And so you can see here that this is the objectives for today. We're going to talk about viruses and compare those to living cells. We're going to talk about the structure of viruses and how viruses infect host cells. And in this chapter, we will also talk about bacteria next time. So if you have not done so yet, go and complete your bell work that is labeled March 1st. Do that, and then come back to this presentation. And you'll need to open up the notes that go along with this. That's the student notes that you can type directly on, and they go along with this presentation. I'm going to give you some background, and then the notes will start. So this time we're going to be doing graphic notes. And so you'll notice that instead of writing sentences, filling in words and sentences, these are actually going to be boxes that you fill in with the notes, but they should be labeled, and so you should be able to see easily what goes where. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so just some background. This is chapter 20 in your textbook, so if you ever need to go read over anything that I go over, just to reinforce your understanding, I always tell you what chapter we'll be in, at least for this semester. So this is chapter 20. We're going to talk about viruses to begin with. And so just to give you an idea, we've taught in this last chapter on taxonomy about classification and how Linnaeus in the 1700s developed the system that we still use today, and then how throughout the 1800s and even 1900s the classification system changed and became more specific as new advancements such as microscope and DNA technology came about. And so 1892 was the first time that a liquid was extracted from infected plants that really was related to viruses, the tobacco mosaic disease. And then just a little while later, another person actually named the particles that were in the juice causing the disease viruses, which means Latin for poison. And then it wasn't until 1935 that we were actually able to crystallize the tobacco mosaic virus. And you can see on the screen here on the left, that's a picture of a tobacco plant that has the virus. So you might not have known that plants and animals both can get viruses, even bacteria can get viruses. And then on the right, you see a diagram of what the tobacco mosaic virus looks like. Viruses are very, very small, we'll see in this chapter, and so it takes an electron microscope to be able to see them. So not a light microscope like you might have used in school. Those are not powerful enough. So this is where you'll need to start taking notes. So it's been fairly recently that we've actually discovered viruses and what they look like. And so the definition of a virus that we are going to use is an infectious particle that is not living. And so infectious means that it can be spread from person to person. You probably feel like you've heard as much as you ever want to hear about viruses lately. But depending on what you read, most texts will say that viruses are not living, and we'll talk a little bit about why. They can only reproduce inside living cells, and so that's one reason. If you think back to Biology 1 about the characteristics of living things, living things need energy, they're made of cells, they reproduce on their own, and viruses can do none of those. Here you'll see an electron image of bacteriophage virus that we're going to talk about, which is one of the most complex viruses. It has the most parts. So let's talk about what parts viruses have. So here you see several different shapes. Here's the bacteriophage I just mentioned, the tobacco mosaic virus, which was the first virus to be discovered, and then the flu virus, which is an animal virus that we've kind of seen a lot of those lately on the news. So there's two parts that all viruses have. Some viruses, like the tobacco mosaic virus, only have these two parts, and that is either DNA or RNA, which are nucleic acids. Of course, you know that's the instruction for living things to make proteins. And then on the outside of that DNA or RNA, a virus will have a capsid, which is one of your vocabulary words, and that's just a protein coat that surrounds it and protects it. Some viruses, like the flu that you see here, will have an additional membrane that surrounds the capsid. You can see here, that's the membrane envelope around it. And viruses can have more than these basic two parts. So tobacco mosaic virus just has RNA and the proteins that surround it. So you can see a diagram of that here, and you can see the microscope image here. Some viruses, like the flu virus, also have that membrane envelope. They have surface proteins. And so they'll have more parts, especially this bacteriophage that has a tail and tail sheath, tail fibers. And this is a diagram of that. It looks kind of like a spaceship. So there are lots of different sizes and structures and shapes that viruses have, but they're all very, very small, even smaller than a bacteria cell. Now, the way viruses infect living things is kind of like the lock and key mechanism that you might remember from Biology 1 that enzymes have. So viruses are very specific to the types of cells that they attach. So the proteins on the capsid of a virus, these little key shapes here, have to fit with the receptor proteins on specific host cells. And so from the video you watched, you might remember that there are viruses that infect certain animals. Those viruses have to mutate to be able to infect different animals. So for example, COVID-19, scientists believe started in bats and then mutated to spread to pangolins. And that's where they came from, the wet market, and they eventually mutated to be able to infect humans. So the capsid on the viruses have to match up with the proteins on the host cells, or they will not let them in. So viruses can only infect specific cells. So you can't catch any necessarily any cold that your dog might catch. They're very specific. By binding to those receptors, though, they trick the cell into letting the virus and its genetic material into the cell. And then once the virus is inside of the cell, it uses its genetic information, the cell's genetic information, kind of takes over the cell to make copies of itself. There's a really good video I'm going to link on the assignment today called Flu Attack, how a virus invades cells. And it's just a very good explanation of how this happens using simple terms. So again, you'll see here, this is one flu virus, and you can see all the parts that it has, the capsid on the outside, and then the little proteins that act like locks and keys to be able to infect certain cells. Remember, you can stop this video anytime and catch up with your notes if you need to. Now we're moving on to lytic infections. And so on your notes for today, this is over on the right side that says 2 types of viral infections in bacteria. So this is bacteria being infected by viruses, but it works in a similar way in eukaryotes like us and other animals and plants. So the first infection is called a lytic infection. And so you'll see in the picture here, the bacteriophage, this is the bacteria cell, this is the virus. The virus attaches to the cell and injects its DNA into the cell. And then the cell starts making copies of the virus. So the cell actually stops working and producing what it needs and starts producing little viruses. Eventually, it makes so many viruses, it bursts the cell, like we just saw in the flu video. If you'll stop this, if you stopped this presentation and watched the video I attached, you saw this happening. If you didn't, you might want to stop now and go watch the flu attack video, because it is similar to the lytic cycle. So things like measles and colds are lytic type infections where you get sick pretty quickly, the virus takes over your cells, but you're not going to have this forever. So you might feel like you are never going to get over the flu, but it doesn't last forever. The second type of infection is a lysogenic infection. Now here we've got a longer word. So if you'll remember, lysogenic infections may take longer to be noticed, but they last longer in your body, even forever. So examples of this type of infection would be warts, HIV, chickenpox, hepatitis B. And so you'll see there's a lytic cycle here where the virus actually does burst the cells and makes people sick. But the first part of this cycle, you'll see the virus again inject its DNA into the host cell, and the virus's DNA actually becomes a part of the host cell's DNA. And so that's why if you ever have the chickenpox, that chickenpox virus is a part of your DNA forever. The viral DNA is a part of your DNA. And that's why people, when they get older, if they've had chickenpox, can get sick again from the shingles, because it's the same virus. Another example would be HIV, where people may not know that they've been infected with HIV for a long time, but they are going to have it for the rest of their life because that viral DNA has become part of their host DNA. So the problem with the viral DNA becoming part of the cell's DNA is that every time that cell divides, the viral DNA is copied. You can see that here. So the red represents the viral DNA, and the loop here, because this is a bacteria cell, it only has one chromosome and it's in a loop here. So that viral DNA has become part of this host cell's DNA. And so every time the bacteria cell divides, that viral DNA gets copied along with the cell's DNA. And so eventually something happens to trigger that viral DNA to kind of wake up and become active. And that's when the lytic cycle kicks in and starts to destroy the cells. So, for example, if you suffer from warts, warts is a virus that your body is kind of bored with, so it doesn't really fight it, but your warts may come and go. Cold sores, the same thing. You may have cold sores when you get under stress or when your lips get dry, so you don't have them all the time. It's always a part of your DNA, but it's not always active. And that is a type of lysogenic infection. So if you can remember, lytic is a short word. You usually get sick quickly, like with a cold or flu, but you're only sick a short amount of time. Lysogenic is a longer word, so you may not know for a long time that you have something like HIV, but once you have it for the rest of your life. And so it lasts a long time. So long word, long time. Okay, we're over back on the left side of your notes again if you're typing along. You remember you can also print these and take a picture and upload it if you prefer to write your notes. But there are two types of RNA viruses. Now remember, all of living things, we have DNA in our cells. DNA is what has the information for our body's operation. RNA is used in our bodies to make proteins, but DNA is the main genetic material. Now viruses are a little bit different. Viruses can either have DNA as their main genetic material or RNA as their main genetic material. Most viruses, about 70%, just have RNA. They have no DNA. And so something like the common cold, because it already has RNA, it can go quickly into producing proteins once it enters the host cell and making new viruses. And that's why you get sick so quickly from the common cold. Something like HIV, however, is a retrovirus, and this is one of your vocabulary words. And so this type of virus is also just has RNA as its main genetic material, but it goes through an extra step where it converts RNA into DNA, and that's how it inserts its DNA into the host cell. So it's similar to the lysogenic infection with bacteria that we just looked at. So retro, when you think about things that are retro, you kind of think back, kind of backwards things. And so this is kind of backwards because normally DNA makes RNA, but here we have RNA being turned into DNA, so it's kind of retro or backwards. And this is the type of virus that AIDS, HIV is. Okay, now finally, okay, so this is funny. This is news that I shared a year ago about the novel coronavirus, 2019. When it was first being found in humans. We talked about this a little bit in class because it was new, and now we know too much about it. Here's a diagram of what COVID-19 looks like. Here's an actual picture. And the reason that it's called a coronavirus, COVID-19 is not the only coronavirus, colds are coronaviruses, is because like we saw in the first diagram of viruses, you have this little corona or little kind of shadow around it caused by the proteins on the outside. So it's kind of like the sun's corona. You know how you see the sun and it has the little flames coming out. It's kind of named for that. That's why it's called a coronavirus, is because of these little proteins that show on the outside. So lastly, viruses and cells is at the bottom of your notes. Now, viruses are actually parasites. So the definition of a parasite is something that lives in a symbiotic relationship with another organism, and it harms the host. And so in this case, a virus is a parasite because it harms the host. The viruses take over the cell's machinery and cause them to burst eventually. They must infect living cells in order to be able to grow. Viruses, we said, cannot grow on their own. So they take advantage of the nutrients and the cellular machinery of their hosts. In this case, it could be plant cells, animal cells, or bacteria cells. And so viruses, even though they have many characteristics of living things, like they can reproduce, they have genes, they can evolve, they can't reproduce on their own. And so that's why we don't define viruses as living things. And so let's look a little bit about how viruses and cells compare, and you're going to watch a video about this as well. So as far as viruses, remember I said they either have DNA or RNA. They don't have both. Cells actually have DNA as the main genetic material, and then they also have cell membranes, cytoplasm. Eukaryotes have a nucleus. but DNA in a cell is the main genetic material. They use RNA to make proteins, but DNA is the main genetic material in all cells. All cells have DNA. With viruses, they may have DNA or they have RNA. They do not have both. Viruses cannot grow and develop. Of course, cells can. Viruses do not eat. They do not need to obtain energy because they take over the cell and use its energy. Of course, cells need energy. Viruses cannot respond to their environment, but of course cells can. That's one of the characteristics of living things. But both of these can change over time, just like we talked about in the last chapter. They can adapt, they can mutate, and that is how viruses jump from one species to another. Remember I said they are very specific to the host they will infect. So you can't catch just any disease from another animal or from a plant, but viruses do have the ability to mutate and jump from one species to another, like for example, bird flu possibly jumping to humans, or swine flu in pigs jumping to humans. And so they have the ability to do that. Here's just a little slide. This is old. This was January 28th, so over a year ago, just showing the cases back then of COVID-19 and just how it spread throughout the world even more, of course, now. This is bacteriophage. This might help you to know later. So remember I said bacteriophages have the most parts. So here is the DNA or the RNA inside. They have a collar. They have the sheath, the tail and the tail fibers. This whole thing that coats it is the capsid. So this is the most complicated virus that you will see. So now that you know a little bit about viruses, you are going to click on the link that's attached to this assignment. It is a video worksheet. Once you go to the video worksheet, you'll see a button to click to go watch the Amoeba Sisters video. And once you watch the video, you have questions to answer on that sheet. And then you'll turn that assignment in. So once you've completed the notes here, go to the assignment attached, which is a sheet of questions. Once you open the sheet, there's a button to link to the video, watch the video, and answer the questions, and then turn it in. And I will see you tomorrow.